pleasure to have Professor Ernest Sternberg. Professor Sternberg, who is from the University of Buffalo at SUNY, will be speaking on Purifying the World, what the radical anti-empire ideology stands for. I think it's a very important issue. And as a footnote, Ernie is one of the, on the board of the SPME. SPME is Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. It's a very important academic organization that's dealing with issues of anti-Semitism and the delegitimization of Israel, the new forms of anti-Semitism. And I met him originally at a conference that the SPME was involved in Toronto, and we were just at a conference in Cleveland dealing with issues of Iran. So Ernie's work is important, and I think today's lecture is actually a very important issue. Ernie is Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Buffalo. He is also the School of Planning is, the Department of Urban and Regional Planning is at the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Buffalo. He's the president and member of the board to Protect New York, the academic society devoted to research to safeguard New York from issues of terrorism and disaster. Ernie has his PhD in administration and government from Cornell University, and he did his undergraduate studies at Ohio State University. He was the chair of Urban and Regional Planning in Buffalo, and he has a long administrative experience at the university. He was at the Peace Corps in Malaysia. He has two books, one on the economy of icons, how business manufacturers have meaning, and also on issues of technology, industrial policy, U.S. responses to technological change. There's many other important articles on related matters. So it's really an honor and a privilege to have you here.
Thanks,
so welcome.
Thank you. I've been told to speak for no more than half an hour. This is really a tough challenge for me because the paper on which I'm speaking took 6 months to write. So I'm going to squeeze all that into half an hour. So I'm going to skip quite a few parts of the paper. Things don't quite add up. You're certainly welcome to look at the paper, which is posted, I believe, on the YIISA webpage. I'll be speaking about, the paper isn't entirely about the causes of anti-Zionism. Rather, the paper is about a new kind of radicalism that has been swamping the campuses and is extremely important, a form of left-wing radicalism that's extremely important throughout the world, has arisen since the fall of communism in the last 20 years. And there's a strong connection between the rise of this new radicalism and the vehemence that anti-Zionism has taken in Europe and on campuses in the United States. I am not by any means saying that this is the only cause of the extreme anti-Zionism that we're seeing. In fact, there are several causes, as we know. There's simply the issue of war and the Palestinians' need to use accusations of various kinds as part of the warfare itself. You know, propaganda and disinformation is part of the war. It's also the rise of Islamism and various kinds, the Iranian version and the other kinds of versions, as well as movements in Europe and almost an emotional need within parts of Europe to find Jews responsible for crimes. And therefore, there's a ready audience for these and other reasons for anti-Zionist accusations. But in addition to these, the rise of this new movement, which I am calling, for want of a better word, purificationism, is as far as the campuses go, probably the single most important cause. I'll give you why. Since I do teach urban planning, I'll explain why I happened to come up on this subject and what has become such an important part of my life in the past 5 years or so. It had to do, it started with a particular lecture that I saw on campus. The lecture was by someone named Norman Finkelstein. And Norman Finkelstein was brought together by people I thought were distinguished members of the campus community at the University of Buffalo. And you know, three things he said that have stuck to my mind ever since and disturbed me a great deal on that day. He said, for one thing, that, let me just recall now, that the reason for the outpouring of books after 1967 about the Holocaust and he estimated about 2,000 books, which may be more or less on track, was that Jewish leadership wanted Jews to write such books so as to excuse the oppression of Palestinians. So there was some kind of a deceitful and secret movement that is possible, and Jews are capable of listening to this kind of instruction to get them collectively to write 2,000 books about this very difficult, disturbing subject. He also said that Elie Wiesel and the Wiesenthals were running all the stuff about the Holocaust to make money. And he also found their activities very amusing in general. Made various kinds of very poor jokes. I'd done just a bit of research on him before he talked, and I found the particular statement he had made that Israel had invited blonde, blue-eyed Russians to Israel, or had allowed them in, so that Israelis could turn themselves into an Aryan race. And I asked him afterwards, what is your evidence that Israelis want to turn themselves into an Aryan race? He said, he was kind of caught by that question. And he said, well, have I read Leon Uris's Exodus? Actually, I haven't read it. But the main character's name is Ari. And he said, there are a much bigger audience than this one, about 200 people. He said, well, you know, Ari is short for Aryan. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Now, what this disturbed me is this guy just a crackpot? But if he's just a crackpot, why is he invited by that time to several dozen campuses, some of the most distinguished campuses around the country? Why is he being invited? And why do the people who invite him not dissociate themselves from him? And now it's true, as an English professor introduced him. English professor later wrote him, which appeared on his webpage, on Finkelstein's webpage, a letter of congratulations and thank you. Another inviter was a distinguished professor of English. And actually another distinguished professor of English. Well, one of the distinguished professors of English, SUNY gives funds for distinguished professorships. They use distinguished professor funds. Other inviters were Muslim students. And the local Peace and Justice group in Buffalo called the Western Europe Peace Center, as well as a church, one of the local churches. Now, it occurred to me, and that Peace Center is most well known for environmentalist green type positions. Why would this particular combination of people bring in a Finkelstein? What is it in it for them? What's the mentality that they would be attracted to this sort of thing and then not divorce themselves from it later? This is the question I asked myself. And divorce, concerned me ever since. It actually led me to join Scholars for Peace in the Middle East and to establish the Buffalo chapter. I started looking, well, is this a one-off affair or is there more going on? I looked at some of the activities of these professors, what they've been writing. It's very easy nowadays. You stick in a name in and put in Zionism or Israel and see what they're up to. Well, it turns out all three of them publish in this, I don't know if it's a magazine or one of these web things called Counterpunch. How many of you have run into Counterpunch? 3 of you have run into Counterpunch. Among the accusations made in Counterpunch, a lot of professors write for Counterpunch. Counterpunch is sort of connected to or offshoot of the work of Noam Chomsky, and believe there's hard global distinction between an evil colonial empire that controls the world and true, genuine human movements that are oppressed by it. The discussion of Israel is probably the most common subject of discussion within that webpage. Among the subjects that have been discussed, several articles suggested or accused Israel or the Mossad of having been behind the destruction of the World Trade Centers. And most recently, this is actually, B'nai B'rith actually took notice of this one, an article by Alison Weir. Alison Weir, by the way, had also been invited to Buffalo, also by the same grouping, to Buffalo State College, to Edison College, accusing Jews, Israelis of systematically harvesting Palestinian body parts for sale. Okay. That's the same crowd. Okay. So where is this coming from? And I am in part in answer to that question that I've been doing my research. It has turned out that I am not the only one who has been disturbed by the larger phenomenon that is causing this. A lot of people are concerned about this as a new kind of anti-Semitism and are aware that a lot of it is coming on the extreme left. But what is the nature of this extreme left? That's what we got to figure out. I'm not the first one to ask this question. Other people, interesting books have been written that I have been influenced by. One is by the French thinker and popular thinker, media personality called Bernard-Henri Lévy. His recent book on this new kind of left is called Left in the Dark, or maybe Left in Dark Times. It's quite interesting. Another one by someone in England named Nick Cohen means What's Left is the name of his book. And both are looking at extremely disturbing trends within the new left that has arisen since the 1990s. As a matter of fact, Bernard-Henri Lévy has several names for it. He finds it a very disturbing phenomenon. He's not primarily writing about anti-Semitism, though it comes in there. He calls it, his most kind word for it is neo-progressivism. Other words are the zombie left, red fascists, new barbarians, cadaverous left, oxymoronic left. These groups don't themselves call themselves that. The terms they have for themselves are anti-globalization, global intifada, eco-socialism, green socialism, counter-globalization, and so forth. Alter globalization, and these kinds of other mixed kinds of words. Peace and justice movement is a very typical one. Both Bernard-Henri Lévy and Cohen have seen in this some kind of dark, disturbing degradation of the left. They also both imply, and I have also found in my studies, that is that this world that comes from many different sources, this world of this new kind of radicalism, many streams of thought converge, many motives, many issues. Yet there seems to be some central characteristic to it, logical characteristic, that makes it seem, or makes it resemble very much like an ideology, one of the powerful kinds of ideologies that had such powerful effect, or horrendous effect throughout the 20th century. Its central feature is a division between the very sinister forces that keep the world repressive as it is, and these consist of global capitalism, very often referred to as empire with a big E, exerting economic forces through multinational corporations that suppress people around the world, suppress communities, and impose on them a homogeneous westernized corporate culture, and use militarism and various kinds of technologies to export this a kind of systematic oppression onto communities around the world and communities within the United States. So that's on the sinister side. That's the bad side. It's kind of a toxic world in which we live. It's this toxic world which is also destroying the environment. It is changing, it is ruining the seasons. It is destroying the oceans. It is polluting our lives. It is changing our biological systems themselves through all kinds of contaminants that have been imposed by capitalism, which does not care about it, by global capitalism, which does not care about its consequences for humanity. It's out there to be greedy and ruthless and to suppress and oppress for the sake of those racist manipulators who control it. As against this stands a new possible future world. This new possible future world is peaceful. It has no war. It is just. It does not believe in nation states. Rather, transnational, non-governmental organizations impose or control justice and impose a higher form of justice on the world. Communities of all types get along. There's no white, cultural, imperialist, Western domination any longer. Rather, cultures celebrate each other. Communities celebrate each other and live in peace and mutual understanding, celebrate each other's existence. This new world has a sustainable economy in which the world operates on alternative energy. It's non-polluting. Species are protected. Human beings themselves find a way of reintegrating themselves with the world's natural ecosystems. The world is safe from destruction by militarism, by weapons, and by capitalist pollution. So we have a kind of new bliss, a pure new world. And those of us, let's say I put myself in the position of those who believe this, Those of us, let's say I'm one of them, who believe this, we have the highest motives. Our motives are pure. We want purity. We want goodness. We want cleanliness. We want everyone to get along. We are against the systematic global power to which we can attribute all the miseries in the world. So this is the fundamental kind of idea. Now, you say you want to check me out. There must be an equivalent to the Western New York Peace Center in New Haven. There probably are several peace and justice groups in New Haven. I suggest if you don't believe that this is the mode of thought, go over and have a conversation. Okay. You'll find people who very much believe in natural food, avoidance of contaminants, purity of life, anti-militarism of all kinds, being pacifist, wanting everyone to get along, all minorities, everyone to get along. Okay. Extremely fearful of environmental change, and extremely distrustful of the powers that be in corporate governance. And you'll find endless web pages reflecting this mode of thought. Just endless. Now, it'd be more appropriate, and in my paper I also go into the theoretical origins or sources of this mode of thought. In the case of 20th century forms of left-wing radicalism, the major source was, of course, the work of Karl Marx and all of the people that came after him. This is no longer, the Marxists and especially old Marxists are still involved, this is no longer primarily a Marxist movement. There's many distinctions and differences between Marxism and the kind of new radicalism that has arisen. In fact, one of the reasons that it's so hard to identify or put one's finger on it is that it has so many different sources. For example, some of it come from the work of Noam Chomsky, who may be an anarcho-Marxist of some kind. Very influential is the work of these two authors, Negri and Hart and Negri, who make the point that there's a global oppressive empire and social movements are like the new proletariat out there to fight it. And commitment, forceful commitment is needed to overcome this new empire. There are various movements, forms of anarchism, and a variation on anarchism called autonomism, very popular in Europe, especially in Italy, and other parts of Western Europe. Deep ecological movements, and all kinds of anti-imperialist thinkers, all kinds of, or various forms of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and post-colonial thought. What I have done is, in this particular paper, avoided trying to make sense or clarify these multiple self-contradicting, contending ideas, and look at the activist literature itself. And there's actually an activist literature cited in the paper. And if you actually look at the activist literature, they kind of avoid the theoretical arcana and focus more on what they're against and what they're for and how they want to go about achieving. And if you look implicitly, less theoretically about what they have in mind, you see pretty clearly that they have divided the world into the evil, toxic world and the potential pure world. And as activists, they are the ones who are committed to the finest, to bettering the world. And their purpose is to fight this cruel old capitalist world and create the wonderful new world that is possible, in which humanity will survive in amity and cleanliness and in a pristine environment. Not only that, a further feature of the new world will be democratic. You see, we do not live, according to this mode of thought, truly in a democratic world. Because if we lived in a truly democratic world, or let's say America was truly democratic, and the Western countries were truly democratic, then people would get what they desire or strive for, right? And people, from the belief system of the purificationists, desire and strive for peace, for clean environment, for sustainable development. Because we don't have it because we don't have a real democracy. We have a pretense of democracy. True democracies would be grassroots democracies or participatory democracies in which all are involved. And therefore, if there is a participatory, not in the sense of elections, but people get together and in these meetings, these fully participatory events, They get to shape their world directly, bypassing legal institutions, checks and balances, parliamentary methods, which slow down the direct relationship between the wants of the grassroots and the new, better world to which they can get committed. So they can claim that the world they want to create is more purely democratic than any kind of democracy that we live in at present. A particular example of the widespread popularity of this movement is what's called the World Social Forum. Excuse me. How many have heard of the World Social Forum? Not very well, no. Okay. The World Social Forum has been created as a reaction to the meetings of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the G8 and so forth, these organizations against which the people I'm talking about are likely to get together and demonstrate. The last meeting was this January in Belém, in Brazil. According to its webpage of this, the organizers of the meeting, there's a meeting, a World Social Forum meeting once a year. It brought together 120,000 people, over 4,000 non-governmental organizations, representing all shades of positions, all kinds, not political positions, but all kinds of people against the destruction of forests, people for equal rights for homosexuals, people against various kinds of abuses and human rights abusements and civil rights abuses around the world, people for forgiving third world debt, for protecting rivers, and so forth. And there were many demonstrations, many meetings. What they have in common? The slogan was, a better world is possible. What is the nature of this better world? The better world will be one, contrary to the one we live in at present. And what will make it different will be, it will be not this capitalist, globally controlled world, global patriarchy. It will be a participatory, ecologically and economically sustainable world in which various groups celebrate each other's cultures and create a better world through participatory democracy. There is a commonality despite the different interests. And here's the fundamental distinction, the way I would make it. Let's say you or I believe in a particular issue. I may very well believe that there ought to be equal protections for homosexuals. I may also very well be very interested in the protection of rivers from degradation. Maybe interested in the protection of Amazonian tribes. But I may say that the way to bring each of these about is to fight for them through a republican system, in which different interests are represented, and sometimes policies are achieved, negotiations are required, compromises are reached, and there are some successes and failures, and we stumble along, understanding that the system allows progress to be made in this kind of fitful fashion. The distinction here, in the new ideology that I'm talking about, very much resembling a totalitarian ideology, is that I believe the present world must be fully overcome because all problems, exploitations, and depredations are caused by this global capitalist system. I want to suggest that this particular worldview, which is, it's up to you to judge, and I cannot fully make the case here, very widespread, has 7 consequences which I have written on the board. I am not going to discuss all 7 consequences. I'm going to focus myself only on one of the consequences, but in the question period, I can discuss any of the others that you wish. Okay, I'm going to talk about anti-Zionism. The possibly greatest European writer on the subject of anti-Semitism is called Andrei Taguieff. Have you had a movie here yet, Charles? Okay. He raised this very interesting question. He observed that in France, he's in France, there was a demonstration for protecting the appellation for Roquefort cheese, the Roquefort. Now, appellation means that, so the brand or the native right to use the term Roquefort in whatever part of France Roquefort is made. The demonstration was because global corporations apparently were trying to use that terminology and make road for it where it shouldn't be made. And Taguieff asked the question, why were there anti-Zionist slogans and anti-Israeli demonstrations there at the Rockford demonstration, at the Rockford event? Or to take another example, why is it at the World Social Forum in Belém, in Brazil, that's at the mouth of the Amazon, it's 5,000 miles from Jerusalem, one of the three major organizers was interviewed, what were the major accomplishments of this meeting in January in Belém? Over 100,000 participants. He said, well, we had pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli demonstrations every single day. And these are people who come for all kinds of issues. In Toronto, there was not long ago, a year and a half ago, an equal pay demonstration. Why were there anti-Zionist statements on the equal pay demonstration? Why is it that your British academics have only even talked about boycotting one country ever? Israel. And no other country. Right now, Norwegian academics are talking about it. What is the explanation? I think the explanation was already right there when I attended that meeting, and just in front of my eyes, it took me a while to get it. The explanation is partly in the very nature of totalitarian ideologies, and has been remarked on very often. If you want to recreate the world, reshape the world into a far better one, and you know that that far better one will be a far more virtuous and blissful one, and the one you are fighting is horrific and can destroy the whole world and oppresses the world, clearly you're undergoing this very great moral struggle you're a part of. But you're fighting a very abstract enemy. Global capitalism is abstract. America is a little less abstract. You can find American domination. It's much easier to have an enemy. If you want to recreate and create a great humanity, you must also have an enemy of humanity. Some sinister force that is preventing this from happening, this transformation from happening. Everyone knows it'd be so great to live in this blissful world, yet it is not happening. What is preventing it? So, it is the need for an enemy of humanity. The Nazis had an enemy of humanity. The communists had enemies of humanity. As a matter of fact, there's a great quote from the great Bolshevik writer, Gorky, who himself says, of course, we were lovers of humanity. But as lovers of humanity, just to have a love of humanity was not, I don't have this exactly, but just to have a love of humanity is really not sufficient. We also motivated people by finding and identifying the enemies of humanity. So I want to suggest that Zionism has a particular role. Anti-Zionism role has this particular important role. Its role is to be the new enemy of humanity. It functions as that because Israel is in permanent war. The conditions of being in permanent war are very difficult to understand. All wars, and everyone's wars have atrocities of various kinds. But if you focus it on very carefully, and you focus, and literally, thousands of organizations are focusing on Israel's activities, looking for things very often, inventing things, exaggerating things. It comes to seem to a lot that there's so much smoke, there must be so much fire, there must be something particularly sinister about Israel. Israel then is coming to have a very important role. Its role is to be that enemy of humanity, that most sinister enemy of humanity, possibly even the one that controls the United States, from which all these depredations come. And what is more, when you get all of these people together, think about all the different kinds of groups like we're talking about getting together. Environmentalists, various kinds of, I would say not quite feminist, post-feminist, almost post-genderist would be the proper term. Radicals, environmental radicals of various kinds, people into abolishing poverty, people into saving the oceans, into helping various groups around the world dam problems or protecting cheese or whatever it may be. What is the common language that brings them together? And that, I think, was the actual explanation for the Finkelstein speech, which is that opportunity to hate through an enemy that everyone could understand was the very basis for creating solidarity in this new world movement.
So, thank you. So we'll have Q&A, and I'll start off the question.
Sure.
I spoke at the World Social Forum actually in Bombay, Mumbai.
You went there, okay.
I was there, and I actually spoke about issues of Israeli-Palestinian peace conflict. So it was an interesting experience. I'm not sure what you're getting at, in the sense that there is a strand clearly in social movements concerned about economic global justice and environmental issues and gender issues that are clearly anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. But what percentage? Who are they? What are their names? What are the names of the organizations? Are there specific groups that are sort of part of the social movement for justice that are anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist? Or are you saying the whole notion of trying to improve the world is somehow part of a totalitarian mindset? Because I think in the sense that, one thing that comes to mind when you're speaking, there's over 1 billion people tonight that will go to bed hungry. The United States consumes much more than 50% of the world's resources every day. There are structural problems, there are economic and political, global and environmental problems that are real. People may use it in times of crisis to push all sorts of agendas, some of them reactionary, some of them hateful.
Right.
So how do you balance a critique of people like Finkelstein and a critique of people who are, I think, genuinely fighting for basic human rights? I mean, it's a basic human right to have food, it's a basic human right to have shelter, it's a basic human right to have education and healthcare. These are basic human rights. So how do you distinguish between people who are fighting for a better future, which I think is
Can I, in a good Jewish fashion, can I return the question?
Yeah, let me just finish.
Sure. Go ahead.
I think as a scholar of society, which we're all here, interested in society, it's perhaps our greatest responsibility to improve the world. As a Jewish person, that's perhaps why we're here. So how do you balance critiquing reactionary, hateful movements that are anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, but those who are really trying to improve the world to make it a better place?
First, let's be careful about the use of the word anti-Semitic, right? I use the word anti-Zionist. I think it is a form of anti-Semitism, but I think it should be called anti-Zionism. This is the current generation of it. It's not race-based, so it's not anti-Semitic in the 20th century sense. Though there are some racism is still a part of it, and that's sort of some of the fringe movements. This is the left fascist or rapprochement, which is a very interesting phenomenon in itself, but deserves extensive discussion. Does happen, but it's not predominant. Anti-Semitism went through various phases over the centuries, including the deicide anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism of those who believe Jews invented capitalism in the 19th century and so on. This is a new phase. It is a form of probably it's a form of Jew hatred, of which racial anti-Semitism was one phase. Okay, but now we've adopted anti-Semitism as a generic term, so yes, it does fall under it. Are these groups anti-Semitic in the ordinary traditional sense of it? They are not. The vast majority of them are not. They are anti-Zionist, or they sidestep it, or just go ahead into the meeting. So the situation, for example, was Durban, right? Now, I assume this audience is familiar with the Durban events. And the question is, this was against xenophobia and racism. And this is what especially incensed Bernard-Henri Lévy. He said that the Durban events essentially whitewashed genocide within Africa, managed to sidestep it. Sidestepped oppression in North Korea, or never addressed it. Didn't address the elimination of various cultural groups like the Nubians, also in Africa. Did not address, of course, female apartheid in Saudi Arabia. It managed not to address the large majority of issues, even though many of these were the very progressive types that you have raised right now. They're there for a better world, against America taking up the bulk of the, I'm not sure it's 50%, but significant part of the energy resources. So why do they waste their time with Zionism? So I can return the question. I mean, why was there such a large bulk of what they were doing? Why did it dominate? Defenders of Durban, Canadian defenders of Durban, I read some articles that said, well, this is not quite fair, there are other things were going on. So there were people going around with placards and chanting, one Jew, one bullet, or one bullet, one Jew, that sort of thing, okay, which doesn't even sound like anti-Zionism anymore. But you know, there are other things also going on. But wait a second, you're there in an anti-racist meeting. The whole tradition of anti-racism and hatred is that if you see it and you ignore it, you're a part of it. So these humanitarian groups were there, saw it, they may not have encouraged it, but didn't fight it. So they were lending, and lending their names to the final declarations. So somehow, even if they were not very direct or they had no particular kicks to get out of attacking Israel, they just let it go. It's part of the price to pay. And I think it is part of the price to pay to be a legitimate humanitarian organization nowadays. I think if you want to be a legitimate humanitarian organization, you've got to pay, at the very least, strong lip service to attacking Israel. Because if you are not, then you seem to be, and in a sense, Israel is perceived or projected as empire's projection into the Middle East by the colonial settler state, false depiction, but colonial settler state in the Middle East. Projected there by the imperial West. And that is not to bring it up and not to be for it is a way of putting yourself outside the mainstream of humanitarian discussion. I think the price to be paid for contemporary humanitarianism is to attack Israel.
So I'm going to my last question.
Go.
So I think my point is perhaps you need, I would say, to be more focused on who you're specifically speaking about, because I can speak about Durban, the Durban conference. I was there. I was on a panel discussion where Harry Bernard Levy was actually there as well. And of course, the official Durban review process was hijacked by people who hate Israel. It's particularly radical Islamists, Iran, other organizations, some governments, some NGOs who really singled Israel out in the most pernicious way. On the other hand, there were NGOs there, there were governments there. We're actually going to have a speaker from the Rwandan mission in Geneva,
yes,
who were, I think, heroes of NGOs, individuals, people at the United Nations who fought against this form of hatred, of Israel bashing or anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism, however you want to call it. So, and these are people that believe in a better world and are working towards a better world. And there were people from Iran, from Iraq, from North Africa, from parts of Africa, other parts of Africa, NGOs of all kinds, really working to defend Israel and Jewish people. So,
but they're dangerous to them because they tend to split it.
So what percentage are you speaking about? Are you speaking about a worldview that wants to improve the world that's inherently tyrannical or reactionary or anti-Zionist, or are you speaking about fringe, 20%, 50%?
My judgment, I mean, for many of the participants in these movements, okay, many of the different movements, the different social movements, for many of them, it's not central to their issue, that's for sure. I think if you want solidarity, I think it's necessary to at least be quiet or fight it as little as possible, because it interferes with the achievement of your issue in a better world to fight anti-Zionism. Exactly what the percentages are, I don't really know. What's remarkable then, but nevertheless, I've given you these examples, and they are contrary examples to what you're saying, such as the Roadford example. Taguieff actually uses the term to explain it. He calls it neo-communism, which is a variation, I think, on what I'm saying. He says this also what brings together, he uses expressions like European post-Christians, Muslims, new radicals, and so forth. It becomes a common language. So clearly they're very well-meaning people. I think that the way I would draw the distinction, well-meaning is not good enough, is whether take the United States, where this movement is growing very rapidly. You believe that improvement is going to be brought about through the checks and balances of a Republican constitutional government, and that through it you can achieve betterment and reform. or the very reason why we had not achieved a fine future is because the system is repressive and must be overcome. That's the division. I'm not sure I can give you a better explanation than that.
Yeah, I have first a comment and then a question.
Sure.
The comment, I spent a lot of time reading over some of your SPME postings before the meeting, and find your writing very entertaining. One way to get it, no, in a good way. but when you were reviewing Levy's book,
Yes.
you kind of pointed to, for him, the critical experience seems to have had something to do with the Cambodian genocide.
Yes.
And the idea that remaking really seems to mean remaking everything was the idea. When you get to that point and you've remade everything and then you get to terrible, terrible evil, that's kind of what turned him around. And I'm wondering, but part of what you seem to be getting at here is that the key predicting variable is people who don't seem to have arrived at that judgment yet, but still think that in order to remake anything, you have to remake everything. Yes. And you've got to kind of redo the whole. So that's the comment. But the question is yet another way to try to get at what I think Charles is asking, but rather not asking it from a political point of view, but from an empirical point of view. You seem to have defined an ideal type here. Correct. Which is somebody who believes in the good world in all these different dimensions, one of even nutritious food, all sorts of things, environmentalism, global warming, it all seems to come together. And then you're also predicting a big kind of cluster of attitudes over there. So you have one big cluster of attitudes predicting another big cluster of attitudes. And I'm wondering, for those of us who are specifically interested in the anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism issue, is it possible to kind of focus on which of the particular beliefs in that cluster are likely to be the strongest predictors of hostility towards Israel? And which are, you've shown that Roquefort cheese can lead to anti-Zionism under some circumstances. That would seem to me to be the exceptional case. There may be other parts of that cluster which are stronger predictors of anti-Zionist attitudes. I wonder if you thought about that at all.
May I just go back to the first part of your
comment? Sure, go ahead.
I find it a little easier to comment on.
Okay.
I'm going to let myself think through it.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. And by the way, I realize for some of you coming, it seems like I'm being very rhetorical. And the rhetorical form in which what I'm talking is because of the nature of a half-hour talk. And please, I do try to be more careful with my words in the article itself. So you can decide if you get to read the article whether I am capable of more systematically presenting the ideas than I do in this quick summary fashion over here. Yes, one of the very disturbing things that Bernard-Henri Levy was concerned about was the way in which Western intellectuals and radical intellectuals were able to ignore the warning signs, to disregard the greatest human killing in human history, which was Stalinism and Mao's China, and Mao was the largest killer in human history, it appears. Estimated numbers between 25 and 100 million people killed, and the Soviet Union, smaller numbers. They actually killed more than Hitler did. The scale of horrific is very hard to compare. There are other scales to look at, not just numbers. And how long the Western intellectuals and left intellectuals managed to ignore all this. It's interesting coming from Bernard-Henri Levy himself, who's very much a leftist and still considers himself a leftist, considered himself a 1968 leftist, wants to bring about an end to tyrannies and to increase human rights. What he's saying is a rebirth of a new kind of left, which poses the same kind of dangers that those old 20th century ideologies did. And in the paper itself, I talk about 4 different social theorists, most prominently Hannah Arendt, who have talked about the nature of totalitarian ideologies, how they project a secular religion, a secular utopia, almost like a through which the world will be bettered. And self-sacrifice, often violent sacrifice, is needed to bring it about. And a particularly disturbing aspect is when you divide the world into the global capitalist power versus the oppressed communities and the environment, what you find is you must constantly divide the world that way, and therefore oppression that cannot be attributed to global capitalist power must remain ignored, which may be the explanation for why Noam Chomsky wrote the book, that an entire book rejecting that there had been a Cambodian genocide. He later retracted that one. Okay. And he has also written favorable articles, or at least a very favorable introduction to the book by Forisson on Holocaust denial. Now, it's not that Noam Chomsky believes that there was no Holocaust. It's impossible. He lost his own relatives in it. It's that from the point of view of this mentality, you don't want any distraction from the idea that world capitalist evil is the most sinister force there is. Okay, now getting back to your more specific question. Look, I've been at this for a few years, but specifically focusing, actually doing writing on it only for about 6 months. And I think a very interesting question is an empirical one. How many groups are participating, what their views are? It's actually very hard to tell, and empirical studies of these groups are rare, and I don't know what your background is or what you do. I think it's eminently worthwhile to do empirical studies, excuse me. What you find is almost everything written about them is by members themselves. There are no outside critics systematically studying the anti-globalization movement. I haven't found a single one. Or maybe you're wrong on this. Okay. So I think we need to learn a lot more about them, and we do need to understand NGOs in the larger context in which they operate. So I can, if you want one particular example, I think you're asking for, and a fascinating example is Amnesty International. Okay. Now, Amnesty was probably for a long time, and I hope I may not be answering your question, but I will partly answering to yours. Amnesty was probably the preeminent, the most distinguished human rights organization in the world. And many still view it that way. Okay. In the early 2000s, when Irene Khan became its director, it started changing its focus. She saw herself, and I have actually just recently an extensive article from the Financial Times about this, an interview with her, saw that its direction ought to be changed. She saw herself as the first representative of the Global South, to use her expression, on its leadership, that formerly Amnesty International had been Western charitable work, and it wasn't sufficiently understood that the depredations in the world were part of a larger systemic set of forces that kept people poor. And when poor people are, then there are poor people, when there are starving people, then within that context, how many of those poor people or starving people care about political prisoners? I have a more specific quote that I actually included in the paper on this. She's also the one who became famous and controversial in the United States for saying that Guantanamo Bay, where 4 prisoners underwent water torture, was the American Gulag, to use her expression. Of course, the Soviet Gulag killed 500,000 people at least, and they were not soldiers. They were not. What's the expression? They were not combatant. Yeah, they're not combatants. They were civilians. So, what is the logic of making? And Irene Khan also did not distinguish her organization from the Durban events. Human Rights Watch did eventually reject the Durban resolutions. Irene Khan and Amnesty International never did. I think the larger world in which the NGO leadership operates is a world in which these radical beliefs are held. I think that's their peer group. That's part of what they consider themselves to be answering to.
So philosophically, conceptually, are you opposed to Zionism? Because Zionism was about revolutionizing the Jewish condition and improving it. It was an utopian vision of the future. So would you be
That's a
opposed to
great
that?
question. Okay, that's a great question. I'm a Zionist. Okay. I don't. I probably am not a Zionist in the respect in which many ideals in society, and people can have their own ideals and hope for the betterment And the American Revolution was based on ideals. Many of the great changes in the United States were based on ideals. But also the changes in the United States were based on ideals which were eventually executed through laws and through a more or less fairly good democratic system. The Zionists had ideals for themselves to recreate their society. They were fighting, especially as it turned out, very good in predicting, far too effective in predicting what the extreme precariousness under which Jews lived in Europe. The society they created in the end became a fairly democratic society and has remained so despite all the wars. There were attempts, probably, unfortunately, many probably misguided attempts to create a new kind of socialist society. I think that kind of weakened Israel for a long time. If you really look at why Jews went to Israel from Europe, I can think of my own relatives. They actually didn't read the Zionist literature. They went there as refugees, they went there hoping for a safe life. So even though the Zionist intellectuals are better known, and we think of the early Zionist intellectuals who are motivated by different kinds of things, socialism and nationalism and religious beliefs and so forth, the people that went there, by and large, the bulk of the people went to escape oppression and to create a decent life for themselves. So I do not view my views as being in contradiction. Okay. Yes.
Thank you for a very provocative, thought-provoking paper and talk. So one comment and one question.
Yes.
First of all, so as you argue that these purification movements are quasi or totalitarian, and you invoke in your paper Hannah Arendt.
Right.
So I'd like to push you on this a little
Please,
bit.
please.
So in my reading of Arendt and Origins, the core component of a totalitarian ideology is that it requires, as she argues, it requires the elimination, the extermination of a group of people from this earth.
Yes.
So you imply that towards the end of your paper, but you don't lay that out as core to her idea of totalitarianism. And if you're going to be making this argument that these modern social movements are actually totalitarian, well, I mean, it's a pretty extreme concept that requires the actual extermination, not just expulsion, not just, it's not just having a political enemy, it's a very, very grand project. So just a little bit of caution in your use of Arendt. Secondly, let me rework Nick Cohen's question. What's new in the new left? What's new in this left? Because as I'm sure you know, many components of this ideology emerged in the 1968 New Left.
Yes.
Sartre calls America a mad dog
Yes.
in his introduction to Fanon. Chomsky is his.
He
We've talked
preceded
about
it too,
this,
right.
right? So tell me, what's new? Have we seen an evolution in this ideology? What are we seeing that's specifically new today in your mind?
It is an evolution of many strands. Some strands go all the way back to the early 1940s and early 1950s. So it certainly has precedents going back a long way. I think we're seeing the emergence, and it is so difficult to determine its ideological core at this point because it has so many aspects to it. And there are so many contending ideas at work. So the simplified, and this is clearly subject to criticism, but the simplified approach I took was to focus on the activist literature rather than the critical literature. And if you read the activist literature, it's simpler. There is a conceptual package there. The package is this combination of cultural, ecological, and economic ideas about how to create a better world and what the enemy of that better world is. It is not based on production, doesn't come into it. As a matter of fact, production is kind of forgotten. The proletarian and class struggle plays a relatively minor role.
But it's anti-capitalist.
But it's anti-capitalist, but it continues to be anti-capitalist. Whether it's fully anti-left or not is a different subject because of certain features of it that are very troubling in their connection to neo-fascism, but it's a separate subject we haven't gotten into. And it is very cultural in many ways. It is based on concepts that, or very common to it, are the concepts that these culture communities are somehow integral organic wholes. And they can somehow have to communicate with each other. Very often some of this literature, there's really no secular role to the left. you have these different cultures trying to communicate with each other and celebrate each other and understand each other, which I think in some ways, if that is maintained, tends to destroy the very idea on which conventional, bourgeois liberal democracy is based, is that there's a realm, there's a public secular realm in which you can all interact that is meaningful and rational in itself. So if altogether, there's not an absolute distinction here, right? And one could say, it's fair to say that I'm just talking about a new left. It's fair enough to say that. I am making a somewhat stronger point. There's continuity and there's change. I'm emphasizing the change rather than the continuity, you're right. And I'm doing that partly for rhetorical purposes, that is true, to become a little more stronger, perhaps.
No, don't give in to me. I think you are identifying.
Yeah. But I think there is something going on. Yes.
Alan, sorry, Alan, then you, sorry.
Okay, sure.
Also comments and a question. We've been blessed by having both Allison here and Bill Finkelstein in Connecticut
You're very lucky.
times.
And at Yale. Finkelstein was at Yale last year.
And we have groups with, I've come to the conclusion that any group that has either peace and justice in its name isn't interested in either. We have in Connecticut, what is it, Connecticut United for Peace and Justice, Combatants for Peace, we refuse to be enemies with anybody but Israel, kind of thing. What I wonder is, with these groups, does the anti-Zionism come from the ideology of the group, or is it that the people who are basically anti-Semitic and find anti-Zionism an excellent way, a socially acceptable way of projecting their anti-Semitism, finding these groups useful vehicles for expressing their hatred?
I think one can't, I think it's sufficient to say that this would happen even if many of the participants have not an anti-Semitic bone in their body, in the traditional sense of anti-Semitic. Many of them, of course, as we know, are Jewish. Okay, some of them attend synagogues.
Which doesn't mean they're not anti-Semitic.
Which doesn't mean they're not anti-Semitic, but certainly not in the traditional sense. I think you can have this because it is. If you imagine a meeting 15 years ago as the anti-globalization movement or the purification movement is rising, and all these different groups on different agendas, I think it would naturally percolate without the need for any conspiracy whatsoever. What would percolate is that those things that create enthusiasm, solidarity, and mutual agreement will continue to be discussed further in other meetings and create solidarity. And I think it was discovered 15, 20 years ago that anti-Zionism did it, that it worked. Now, at the same time, that coincided with the interests of true anti-Semites, neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, who are also circulating around. And that alliance is I don't discuss it in the paper, but at a further point I do want to get into it. The left-fascist alliance is a very interesting one, and something that this version of the left is constantly trying to suppress and to deal with and to accommodate to in various ways. It's a very tense problem within their movement. I can give examples if people want, but I'm asked to do that. Yes?
If globalization would seem to be the ultimate problem for these groups, are these groups basically isolated and sort of one-issue groups, or are they able to get together on the broader issues that may not affect their one-issue interests?
Right. One of the many terms that they use, and probably one of the very descriptive ones, is the expression movement of movements. I don't know if you're into the expression movement of movements. If you use any of these terms, movement of movements, anti-globalization, counter-globalization, just stick them into Google, you're going to get endless stuff on this. You have both. You have those that are single interest groups, and you have those that are trying to make these interest groups converge and work together. So those are the people with an interest in capitalist change per se. Anti-capitalist per se is their major item of agenda item. And what they may be coming at it from anarchist points of view, or neo-colonials, post-colonials points of view, or neo-Marxist points of view, and so forth. So you do have both. So you have something like the Seattle demonstrations, which we just started, and then most recently in London. You have the Black Bloc, these guys men and women dressed in black clothes, they're anarchists, okay? You have those people against the destruction of the Amazon forest, maybe that's like mainly what they're into, okay? Other people want debt forgiveness, and endless other issues. This creates a platform or role for all these groups to believe that they are working together towards a better world. Because why is Amazon being destroyed after all?
But are they really working together, or are they just sort of, one group seems to want them to work together? And also, is anti-Zionism another group that can be separated from some of the more peace and whatever groups?
There are both specifically anti-Zionist pro-Palestinian groups or anti-colonialist groups, yes. But I think anti-Zionism is becoming the common language, the object of hatred through which to create solidarity. So a lot of groups that have no conception of what Israel is about or Middle East history will be on board because that's just the way you're part of the whole movement.
Can they be separated from the anti-Zionist groups?
I think there are single-issue anti-Zionist groups too, that also exist, yes. And many of them are connected to Arab sources, Arab money, and so on.
Anybody else have a question? Comment?
Could some of these demonstrations, even though they're meeting for totally different reasons, be called on for incitement to violence? You wrote about that, more so dealing with Iran and so forth and so on. Are they not big enough to do that? Or it's only with states?
Well, the relationship between these groups and violence is a very interesting one and very touching one within the various coalitions of movements, because many of them are pacifists too, and they want to keep the pacifists on board. So the coy word that is used is resistance. And it's very hard to tell what resistance means, and so it is kept. But much of the activist literature actually discusses violence and whether they should support violence or not. There is great support, for example, for the Zapatista movement, one of the early success movements. In Mexico, which was violent, but seen as justifiably violent to overcome oppression. And the same authors here in the United States will then ask themselves, should we also engage in violence? And often the answer is no, it would never work in the United States, and we'll just turn people against us. At the same time, there is this almost a fan, I refer to them as intifada groupies, people who are in favor of various kinds of violence and inflame it or incite it in various ways. But very rarely, I think, in a legal sense. I think in a legal sense within the United States, you have to say that you as a person should kill him as a person, okay? Her as a person. Very generic stuff like that is quite legal in the United States. So I don't think there's any legal basis, unless it is pointed at persons, individuals. Sure.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm from Germany.
Yeah.
I'm here for 2 months now, and in Europe, or especially in Germany, you have a great skepticism against democracy in this kind of movements.
Yes.
And there's a long history of anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism in Germany, and I found in private discussions or when I talk to people who are in this kind of movement, there's also, you find a deep skepticism towards democratic principles. There was the democracy was established in Germany, but from the outside and so on. And so I wonder how it works here, because I always thought that conflict solving in a democratic way is more, accepted here, or more plays a greater role, and there's a kind of barrier against these pro-violent groups. And I mean, in Germany, I am not astonished by the fact that there are so many people who don't believe in a democratic way of solving conflicts, social conflicts, and there is a tradition of radical movements and so on. But what do you think? Does this play a role here too? General skepticism towards democracy, or is it not so?
Wouldn't those same movements very often say that they actually are democratic, but they're democratic in a better way? Grassroots democratic, I don't know what the German words would be. That the democracy that rises up from the bottom is a truer form of democracy than the kind of democracy that works with, Republican structures, legislative, judiciary, slow, creaky, tiresome, and so on. Don't think they would say that?
Depends, yeah.
Yeah, it depends.
Yes.
How does it work here in the United States? Here in the United States, it has moved more slowly than in Europe. These things are more pervasive in Europe than they are here. They're moving somewhat faster in Canada than it is here. Here, it has gained most influence on campuses and within these peace and justice groups, and they are still quite small. So the actual impact on conventional politics is relatively limited. And they are closely interwoven with these non-governmental or NGOs, which are also greatly influenced by this mentality. I don't think they have entered the mainstream in United States politics. So a representative group may be the Green Party, for example, but the Green Party represents itself with ideas here in the United States that are considered bizarre by mainstream Americans. So their only foreign policy of the Green Party has been detestation of Israel. They have no other foreign policy. But the Cynthia McKinney, who's the head of it, also was on one of these Gaza boats that entered Gaza to deliver assistance and to use it for propaganda purposes. But she also accused the United States government of, after the Katrina floods, secretly burying 6,000 bodies, not to reduce the toll of to show that the destruction wasn't as great as it really was. In other words, there's very conspiratorial, peculiar-mindedness. So the Green Party doesn't even properly represent this movement in itself in the United States, and all the reasons they're quite marginal still. So I think answer to here is that they're still at the margins.
I'm curious about this, the theoretical compatibility of this lip service to grassroots democracy and support of indigenous cultures and their ways, such as like authoritarian structures in Islamic nations. Like, do you think this is a temporary thing, or is it like a feature that will be continuous throughout the movement of is it necessary to have this dichotomy of oppressor versus victim, with the oppressor being anything American, so that anything the victim does is acceptable, despite it being in direct opposition to this idea of consensus decision-making or participatory democracy?
This is one of the internal tensions, I think, within the movement, and why I think Islamism is not really part of it. I think it's in an alliance with Islamism, and within the American setting, Muslims are considered one of the minority movements and cultures to be protected. But I think they know they're not the same as Islamism. They're just engaging in various kinds of cooperation, mutual reinforcement. I should probably say that the more correct way in which I present this to state, instead of using the word consequences in the paper, I use the word warning signs. Because I think we are in a transitional phase. I do distinctly identify this movement as an ideology, not as a regime. A regime would bring about all kinds of, it would be an actual government setting in which some of these ideas are attempted. The only place where this is actually being tried is in Venezuela, for example, where Chavez has come out very much spouting these kinds of ideas. He calls it 21st century socialism or eco-socialism, but very much reflecting this conglomerate of ideas from Chomsky and others. These ideas, such a movement definitely depends on this binary opposition between the pure and the evil. I think that is necessary. How it will deal with actually having power or holding a regime is a separate question. If we look at Venezuela as an example, what you see is the creation of numerous local councils. As a matter of fact, thousands of local councils, which are stated as proof of grassroots democracy. and therefore to claim that Venezuela is more democratic than the United States. But of course, what you have on top is the strong man and the suppression of the media. But of course, the media is part of the corporate global conglomerate, so you must suppress it. So, I may have lost track of your question along the way. Maybe help correct me if I didn't
Just
quite
whether the tension will need to be resolved, or whether there it's
internal tension.
I mean, yeah, between this alliance with like Islamism or I mean, anti-Zionism in general.
And well, and the further tension between the anti-authoritarian, anti-centralized government kind of feature that this movement has in general, so semi-anarchist features, and the fact that if you want to be environmentalist, you have to control things. You have to control, how much oil is used and whether it's going to be nuclear energy or not, and how much people travel and so forth. So you need sort of coercive governmental structures to bring it about. If you have this no sense in which we know what kind of institutions can work, because all institutions are. So that's another tension. There's several tensions, and I think the very feature to watch out for with these warning signs is that when a regime is created, the regime will have to hide from itself its internal contradictions. And that is one of the things that is so reminiscent of the creation of the Soviet Union, where, if you think about it, to Marx, okay, had his own vision of this beautiful society in which everyone received material goods according to his need and worked according to his ability. And it was 100 years between then and the 20th century recreation of slave labor. Massive, hundreds of millions of forced labor under communist rule. Yet, it was still communist, it was still Marxist. So it is possible, under conditions of totalitarian ideology, to have a society that lives according or pretends or expresses one set of beautiful ideas, but lives under an extremely repressive system. We know that is possible. And we know that these are not the first idealists to come along that we're talking about. So we don't know how they're going to deal with their tensions. To some extent, they'll split apart for sure. Some will fall off.
How do you view the Obama attempt to reform healthcare and intervene into the marketplace of medicine?
Obama's a very difficult person.
With regard to medicine, healthcare, is that part of the ideology that you just responded to?
No. That is conventional American liberalism. But he has interesting associations with people like this, and those are interesting in trouble. We don't know what kind of person he really is. And I could go more about that, but I'm not sure that's not the topic. Yes.
Final questions.
Okay, I'm just thinking about how you, we've all encountered these people and tried to have rational discussions with them, and they're very difficult to win,
Yes.
those sorts of discussions. And I'm thinking, well, where do you probably can't get traction in a debate with the people themselves. The battle is really for the broader liberal community on the college campuses, and that battle has to be waged. You're never going to sell a Burkean conservatism, I think, on the American college campus. You have to kind of just sell a more reasonable form of liberalism. But then I started thinking, well, we kind of defeated communism without ever winning over the intelligentsia on the college campuses. Is it possible that these problems could, that the academia will remain basically heavily influenced by these forces, and yet the battle will be waged elsewhere and won elsewhere? Maybe that's the way to go. Maybe the battle is not trying to convince and not trying, the critical battlefield is not the college campuses, but elsewhere. I was wondering, have you given thought to tactics here? That's the question.
First, as the one who was, disturbed by that particular thinking, I'm a very correct reflection of what my own feelings. I actually couldn't sleep that night. It was just running through my mind, And well, at a personal level, I had to figure out what I could contribute. So I joined the Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, but this little administrative stuff is kind of boring and not really my strength. And those little essays I can do. I wondered, because I do have, despite being an urban planner, my background is in planning theory, so I do have a fair amount of background in social and political thought. So I thought maybe the one thing I could contribute was trying to give a theoretical investigation of what was going on. So that can be my little role on a personal
Mhm.
level. I think many of us can seek these roles because there are so many openings in which to have them, to do something. I want you to find one's niche in which one is good. In terms of strategy, I think there's an enormous amount of defensiveness that goes on about Israel. You have to understand, I'm not here because I think, Israel is so hunky-dory and perfect. It's a very troubling and difficult situation. I've lived in Israel for 2.5 years. In a situation of constant war, you have all kinds of problems. And America's greatest wars have included, and the finest wars, such as America and Europe fighting the Nazis, has had very troubling aspects to it, okay, which we could discuss. I could even tell you troubling things after the landing in Normandy. French women were raped by American soldiers. It really troubled Eisenhower. He didn't want to stop he was so upset about it, but he felt that to investigate would slow down the process. I mean, he gets young men out there doing young men out there, 18, 19-year-olds, with guns, all kinds of things happen. It's one of the terrible things about war, which you remember. I am not an uncritical fan of Israel. I am a supporter of Israel. I believe Zionism is a good thing that happened, and I'm glad it happened. I'm here because I'm an anti-Zionist. Because the very forms that anti-Zionism has taken is so reminiscent of anti-Semitisms of the previous generations that we have seen. It's so extreme. If it weren't so extreme, I probably would not have woken up. And the question is how to deal with this extremity strategically. I think we've got to get more on the offensive. Because I think it is a form of global injustice. So I think that language can be helpful, at least in my view, and that's the position I would take. Okay. It is not about constantly having proof that Israel is okay and didn't do this and didn't do this. There are more allegations than Israel can possibly have achieved. There are far more allegations, there are thousands of allegations. The most recent allegation to come out of crazy allegations, to come out of this United Nations Council, one of the minor reports not paid attention to, is that Israel is discriminating by having female soldiers look at women wearing a burqa when they come into Israel, to see if they're really women. Because this can be embarrassing to transsexuals. And Israel is violating their rights as transsexuals. Now, can you imagine that? Who does that? And, maybe two or three people have been inconvenienced and embarrassed. But I mean, who investigates Libya that way? Who investigates any other country that level of specificity? It's just a level of craziness that is, it's not that Israel has to be explained, that craziness has to be explained. That irrationality needs an explanation. That's what I'm attempting here, for better or worse.
Okay, so on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Before you go, if you want to, Monday at 12 o'clock, David Menashri is speaking. He's the head of Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. He's in the U.S. He'll be here 12 o'clock Monday. And if you want to sign up, please do so because there's food. You have to RSVP. And today's the deadline.